Good evening, everybody. I'm really excited for tonight's conversation. We are here to talk about what research says about parents and parenting with disabilities. I was going to say intellectual disability because that's usually what I say. But it's not just intellectual disabilities tonight. It's really about parents and parenting with all disabilities. I'm very excited to introduce you three, because I'm including myself, so three people who do research and have been doing research in this field for quite some time, and who have been very sort of specific also in how they did research, and their results have led to painting the image that I think is very similar to what parents experience. So I'm really excited to share that with you all. So I will first introduce, or not introduce, but sort of ask Laura Pacheco to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her research.
So hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning for maybe some people that'll be listening later on. My name is Laura Pacheco. I am originally from Montreal, Quebec, and have recently made the move to Newfoundland. And I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Memorial University. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I look forward to our rich exchanges as well. I look forward to hearing about the work, not only of all of us that are here today, but of future chats as well. So my research has been primarily with parents that have an intellectual disability. So my thesis was on mothers with intellectual disabilities from ethnocultural communities. So really exploring what their lived experiences were, how their narratives were really influenced by different messages, not only in society, but also from their cultural community, and how this shaped their life. I think one of the most important things that came out of this study, and I think a lot of the research that's being done, is related to resilience. So these moms talked about some of the abuse they experienced, whether on individual or systemic levels, but they also demonstrated incredible resilience. And at the center of that was the love that they had for their children, no matter where they lived. So that was the part of my beginnings. And then, with some of the partners that are here tonight, we've done research, looking at assessments and interventions from a critical perspective, looking at what the strengths are, but also what some of the gaps are, exploring systems capacity. So that's research that we did with Dr. Maurice Feldman, with Marjorie, and with David McConnell, who is the principal investigator. So looking at what are the needs within our system, within the Canadian context, and how can we build interconnected services for families that are headed by parents with intellectual disabilities. And then what we're looking at now is examining court reports. So these are court reports in Quebec of parents with an intellectual disability. And we looked at what were some of the conclusions within these court reports, what was it based on? So what was the evidence that judges use in order to make decisions in the lives of these families? And as you can imagine, intellectual disability and the link with them being identified as unfit parents was a prevalent theme. And we also looked at the ways in which parents with intellectual disabilities, from a critical discourse analysis perspective, were constructed. So what were the words that were used to identify them and to pathologize them in the end? So that's a quick version of some of the research that I've been doing with colleagues, with Marjorie and with colleagues around the globe as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Coralie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you, Marjorie. Hi, everyone. So my name is Coralie. I have a PhD in community psychology. I'm also a psychotherapist, and I'm currently working at two universities. I'm a professor in psychology and mental health. And I'm also doing research in another university here in Montreal, Quebec. My thesis was about parents with physical disabilities only. And I met with mothers and fathers. And now I'm currently, research-wise, I'm working on obstetrical violence in the general population for now, but maybe I will have more women with physical disability population in the next phase of the research. And I'm also working on reproductive coercion within women with physical disabilities. So it's directly linked with my thesis, where I found that some women had lived some reproductive coercion. It could be not to have children. They were pressed not to have children, for example. So I will be interested to go deeper in those kind of experience.
Great. Thank you so much. And Evelina, will you introduce yourself?
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be part of this nice group this evening in Montreal. My name is Evelina Pituch. I thank you so much, Marjorie, for putting up the group tonight and for the invitation. So I am an occupational therapist by training, and currently I am conducting research and my PhD at University of Montreal in the School of Rehabilitation, so with a background in rehabilitation. And so my PhD focuses also, similar to Coralie's population, on parents having a physical disability or a neurological disability, and having also children in the preschool aged period. So I was really interested in better understanding what are the needs of those families headed by one or both parents having a physical disability. In our research, we were pretty inclusive, so we considered parents having also other kinds of disabilities. It could be intellectual, developmental, autism, mental health issues whatsoever. And so in the course of my research, we conducted a few studies, mostly qualitative based. So similar to what Laura was mentioning earlier, in terms of having a better understanding of the lived experiences of those parents from a qualitative perspective, and also bringing that occupational therapy, that rehabilitation perspective into account. And we were also interested in those studies in better understanding what were the assessments, the assessment means used with parents with physical disabilities. And so in conjunction with those qualitative interviews we conducted, we also performed some home-based observations to have a better understanding of how parents accomplish their daily parenting role and their life skills when they have a young baby at home. Yeah, so I think that sums it pretty much.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just briefly introduce myself, because if I don't, my colleagues are going to tell me that I should. Mm-hmm. So I am a mom with a physical disability. I sustained a spinal cord injury 10 years ago. But before that, I had been working in the field as a psychologist, as a healthcare manager, and as a researcher for 15 years in the field of parenting with intellectual disabilities. So I was already sort of pretty aware that there were definitely disparities and struggles, discrimination and stigma, prejudice, facing parents with disabilities. And then when I became, a mom, I was already a mom to a 16-month-old boy. So when I became a mom with a physical disability, I sort of experienced some of it, and some of it not as much or not at all in comparison to the clients that I served. And I think that in big part, when I didn't go through the same disparities as my clients used to, I think it's really in relation to privilege, status, and the fact that I was already working in the system and knew how to work the system. So it certainly gave me an easier maybe way to navigate how I could get services for myself and for my son. It also helped that I knew lawyers. That was pretty good. So I'm really excited to be here. For us, it's really part of a series of events that we're calling Amplifying Voices of Parents with Disabilities. And those events, really bring forward parents who have a disability themselves, researchers and clinicians like we have today. And next week on June 1st is our big event, which is, we have 12 speakers, and those 12 speakers are 12 parents with a different disability who will be sharing 5 minutes, a little story about how they became trailblazers or advocates for themselves, which had an impact on parents, like other parents with disabilities as well. So it's quite exciting. And if you want, I can send you the information in the chat later. So we're going to dive in right away into a deep question. I've just mentioned about the disparities and the discrimination and the stigma. So this is open, it's a conversation. So you guys, you decide who will go first and so forth. What were the disparities, the biggest disparities that you've seen in your research as you were talking to the moms and dads and parents with disabilities that you've met?
Shall I go? I'll start the conversation off, and please just jump in. I think that, and something certainly that I encountered, but I think it's something that's echoed throughout the research since the 1940s, but the impact of poverty. So it's not the intellectual disability per se, or the disability per se, that impacts parenting the most, but the social position of being impoverished and living in social conditions because of a social identity. So to me, that was and still is one of the biggest disparities, particularly, I'm speaking more particularly related to parents with intellectual disabilities, and my colleagues who are involved in research that includes diverse disabilities, please, speak to that too. But the impact that has on the everyday lives of families headed by parents with intellectual disabilities is quite striking. Marjorie mentioned this already, but the social and systemic barriers that these families face. So many of the families that were in my study were involved with child welfare, and we know that many of these families are overrepresented in child welfare. So about 1% of parents with intellectual disabilities exist, and in Canada, over 10% of all child maltreatment cases include a caregiver with a cognitive impairment that is usually identified as an intellectual disability. And out of that 10%, over 50% of parents with an intellectual disability will lose custody of their child whether it's temporary or permanent. So these are huge disparities, and there's also health disparities, increased rates of anxiety and depression and trauma that are not well treated either. So that's quite significant. And when we're talking about what impacts parenting, while having to deal with the daily struggles of having to navigate your social world, potentially with trauma and not having treatment, we can imagine the impact that has, and where we need to continue doing our work.
For me, I didn't have a lot of parents who were living in poverty. I don't have a representative sample in that way, but I would say for the parents I met who were living with physical disabilities and who became parent with their disabilities, they didn't, for most of them, they didn't became acquired their disability after being parents. So most of them, it was the lack of knowledge and the discrimination experienced in their relationship with the professionals. So most of the times the medical staff didn't know it was possible for them to become pregnant, for example, or which impacts the physical condition would play in the pregnancy, for example, or in the delivery. So it was always a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty, and it was really hard to get answers. And most of the time, and it plays in obstetrical violence as well, but most of the times medical staff are not always interested to know more, and they are categorizing. So you automatically are a high-risk pregnancy, so you will go to high-risk pregnancy clinics, either if you qualify or not to high-risk pregnancy, but we don't know, so you are an high-risk pregnancy. So it could be really discriminant for most of the time it was the women who were reporting those kind of discourse from the professionals.
And maybe if I can add to the conversation, so in terms of disparities, I would say in my research, what I've noticed maybe being one of the biggest disparities is in terms of having access. And access from a very large point of view, so access to services, access to information, having physical access to both either information or services if the parent is a wheelchair user or other kinds of mobility aid in daily use. So I would say that's a big disparity. So for example, in terms of having access to information, it could be a parent who wonders, well, what are the physically accessible daycares in my neighborhood where I could go and drop my child for the day, for example. In terms of having access to services, well, in terms of, like Coralie, you mentioned having access to healthcare services, well, it's being aware that those services exist, that they are inclusive of parents with disabilities, having the knowledge in due time of those services. So I've interviewed some parents who did not know of the resources that they could have used at the proper time of their journey or their rehabilitation, for example. When services exist, sometimes they offer pretty short periods of services, so in a rather short period of time. Whereas the funny thing is, parenting is a life role, right? So it's over a continuum, and unfortunately there currently, from my knowledge, and maybe you have other examples to share, our healthcare, our social services, and so on are not supporting parents throughout their life journeys. So whether it's when their children are young, getting older, etc., their needs vary greatly, but there is no structure in place that can really support them throughout their parenting journey.
I'm really glad that you all sort of touched on key points that I think is definitely highlighted in research, one thing to talk about accessibility. Next week for us in Canada is Accessibility Week. So it's a pretty big week. There's a lot of conversation about how to provide and make sure that there's more access to services. Yet we are in 2022 and still sort of wondering, what kind of access for parents with disabilities. I was doing a quick search today in Statistics Canada. I was trying to find statistics about parents with disabilities. And I was looking, but in the same time, I sort of knew I wasn't going to find anything, but I just wanted to make sure, because I was going to potentially talk to a minister, a Canadian minister, who's involved in employment and disability inclusion. So I wanted to just make sure that in case some statistics sort of grew in the last week or so. And again, sort of what comes out is families where the child has a disability, and the little that comes out that talks about sort of potentially parenting, although it doesn't mention parenting, it sort of mentions, 15 to 64 years old, adult or young adult with a disability. What it says is that they're less likely to be employed. If they're living on their own or single, they're more likely to be living under the poverty line in Canada. And those to me were significant. And when we talk also about access, but yet we don't even sort of think of asking the question, where is parenting happening in this population? Then how can we ensure that we have the right services? And that is sort of a question that I think all of us think about often. So before I go on to the sort of next question that touched upon sort of the rights of persons with disabilities, any of you want to sort of mention something about disparities before we go on? I mean, we can still come back and forth, but just want to make sure.
Maybe I just wanted to react to what you just shared, Marjorie. So I believe you are unfortunately correct in terms of you looking up the statistics. From a Canadian perspective, I think the closest we can get is having a sense of how many women or girls with disability of reproductive age have a disability. If I consider in the province of Quebec, and I believe Coralie also, as where you did some research in the area, I think our last statistics, provincial statistics, specifically regarding parents with disabilities, were collected 30 years ago, so somewhere in the 90s. So I think it adds kind of to the problem, in the sense that if we don't know how many parents are they, how can we actually even think of services and of support systems if we don't know who are we talking about? So I think this is a big issue, and I was just reacting to what you shared in terms of Canada and the province of Quebec, but unfortunately, I believe the situation is kind of similar in other regions, provinces, or countries around the world.
Yeah, we're all struggling for those statistics. I was recently talking to Daniela Easy, who is a mom who's quadriplegic. She lives in the States, and she gave birth 2 years ago to twin girls. And I was talking to her, and she was talking about like, okay, you're a researcher, like give me statistics, like how many are we, and what does it look like, and how many services. And I was like, I'm a researcher and I don't have those numbers because I can't find them. And we have to sort of like sometimes use a lot of creativity to get a little bit of a sense of, 1% in the population, yet 10% represented in child welfare. So we try to sort of identify that there's, a large population and bigger than we think, in terms of parents with disabilities. And that's pretty much across, certainly the UK, we know, the Sweden, we know, Iceland, Canada, Australia, the US, those are countries that we have quite a bit of research in this area. So definitely unfortunate. The next sort of question that I wanted to bring forward. So we all know that there is a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities that exist. It has been ratified by most of the countries that I just mentioned. Which means that when you ratify it, you're supposed to sort of put it in place or sort of listen to it and sort of try to follow it as a way to inform your services and the way you organize the healthcare system. So in this convention, there's a specific article that we often cite that's called Article 23, or it's not called that, it's called the Right to Family. It's Article 23 in that convention. And it really talks about sort of the right to choose if you want to be parent, how many kids you want, how, how often, depending on like when you want to have your children. And it also talks about sort of the responsibility of countries to offer services. So if I bring this article to your attention right now, what are things you would like to say about the convention, this article specifically, and maybe how it relates in terms of your experience and research data?
Maybe I could start. We talk about the convention, we talk about support, we talk about services. In my thesis, I focused more on universal services. So the services that are supposed to be for everyone, without regarding any specific things. For example, the maternity wards. When you are pregnant, you are supposed to be able to go to a maternity ward if it's your choice to deliver your baby. Even if you are living with disability, if you are living in the street, if you are super rich, anything. So, and literature tends to show that people with disability would value universal services, because sometimes they are less discriminating, and they are less pointing out their disability. If I am a future mother living with disability, maybe I don't want to be treated in another way of future mother without disability. Sorry for my English. I hope you can understand my point. So usually, despite the fact that parents with disability would value universal services, they are they receive like more specific services that are not meeting their needs. That's my point. So maybe that's what I want to point out, and maybe maybe we can discuss more about what we should do, implement more special ed services for parents with physical disability, and in support to the Article 2023 of the UN Convention, or do we want promoting more inclusive universal services? So with medical staff that will know a little bit about your life and will search what you are to answer your question, for example. I don't know if I'm clear. I'm sorry. It's been a long day for me.
You're very clear. It's perfect.
So that's what maybe we should discuss, what we want to do about the services we want to implement.
I think that's it. If it's okay, I'll jump in there. I think that's a great question, and I think it's a debate within research and in practice. Should we be exploring inclusive services for all people that include all their needs, or should we be offering specialized services that are more targeted, that are more individualized? And of course, I think that we can argue both, and I think that our families might argue both. But certainly what I've heard from a lot of parents with intellectual disabilities is that specialized services can be, like Kahadi is saying, stigmatizing. So it's a label that a lot of the families that I've worked with have ran away from, especially when they were diagnosed as a child, and particularly as they became adults, because it usually led to child welfare intervention. So I think that families might say that they would want to have inclusive services that are in their community, and that they have workers that are well equipped and well resourced in order to meet their needs. I would then sort of want us to think about, if we're looking at inclusive services, then what should that look like? And I think we have some ideas in terms of interconnected support and sharing knowledge, but how do we ensure that people then don't fall through the cracks and that their needs are not being met, that workers, let's say, in perinatal clinics are able to support a parent that maybe might need more visuals or more coaching or repetition. So, I think we have some answers to that, and we have research that's begun to sort of unpack that. The program in Australia, in terms of Healthy Start, that looks at creating these hubs of services so that practitioners are working together. They have similar frameworks, knowledge base. This is related to parents with intellectual disabilities, but knowledge base around best practices are shared so that everybody has access. But the goal is that it is ultimately provided by basically mainstream services, but that they're equipped. What do you think, Evelina?
Well, I think first it's a really interesting debate in terms of, do we want specialized, specific services, or more in terms of universal, inclusive services? I guess my current understanding, or how I see it for now, is it shouldn't be a either or, but both. I think our support systems would be stronger if we had actually better mainstream care services, community services, and resources that would be inclusive and that would consider the needs of all parents, including parents with disabilities. But also reflecting on your question, Marjorie, and the infamous Article 23, and that UN Convention has also many other articles that are really interesting in terms of having access to healthcare, in terms of having access to rehabilitation services, having access to mobility aids, and so on. And all these issues touch in a way, parents and their children as well. So I think it touches on other issues than only starting and having a family. But that being said, going back maybe to an earlier point I made in terms of having access. So here in Montreal, we have a specialized service, clinical service that was founded and that is still delivered by occupational therapists. It's called the Parents Plus Clinic, and they are existing here for over 20 years. And unfortunately, I know for a fact that they still get each and every week the comment from other healthcare providers and service users, oh, I didn't know you existed. So, and I think we also, I don't know, there's I think a big thinking to be done in terms of how do we make sure that parents have the services that they need in due time? How do we make sure that their services respond to their needs? I see also some big issues in terms of if we want to promote more inclusive and more mainstream services, well, who will be those knowledge providers, those service providers? I mean, there's a big issue in terms of training and continuing education, and it's unfortunately, to my knowledge, not a topic that is really much discussed in healthcare and in our education for our future healthcare and social workers. So there's a lot of thinking to be done, I think, in terms of organizing better support services for parents.
I think
Yeah,
before,
if
go ahead, Kali.
No, I wanted just to add and to jump in. We work a lot in silos, so even you are either you are a person with a physical disability or with an intellectual disability, or you are a parent. But most of the times it doesn't cross. So we have to think a little more in an intersectional way to provide maybe more powerful services.
Yeah. Well, Kali, that's exactly what I was going to ask. And actually, I was going to ask Evelina to talk a little bit more about that, because in your research, Evelina, that was pretty evident when you asked that question to focus groups, how, you know, there's that clear gap, and it's, you know, you're either sitting on that chair or this one, but you can't be sitting on both chairs. Do you want to talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you. And I really agree, Kali, with the point you just made. And I believe, Laura, you shared earlier that those parents continuously fall between the cracks. And although I know your population of interest is parents with intellectual disabilities, it's really a finding that we had also in our research with parents with physical disabilities. So we have some really absurd situations. For example, a parent, which happens to be an adult, will have home services, for example, in terms of personal care assistance. But that same parent, who would be a mother, a father, a parent, who would need support for their parenting in terms of childcare or I mean, anything that a parent would need.
Washing clothes.
Exactly, washing clothes. Well, that same parent has very difficult support. I was going to say has no support, but I know there's some happy exceptions. So it's kind of those situations we're talking about the same person, but somehow our system thinks about their individual needs, but not their social needs. And I guess, as being a clinician and rehabilitation worker, I think we tend to think about a number of roles that are maybe more productive, like a worker, or like how do we make sure that this person can return to work after their trauma, accident, or illness. But there's many other social roles in the life, so including for some being a parent, right? So I do think that we need to kind of reinvent how do we support persons with disabilities who are also parents, who may wish to be a parent someday. So that was also a finding in our research, in terms of, well, maybe now I don't want to be a parent, but having a disability, I want to know what are my options in terms of reproductive healthcare options, and how will my disability impact my pregnancy, and how what kind of supports can I have once I will have a baby. So all these questions, and yes, so going back to your initial question, Marjorie, that was repeated over and over by parents, how much they fell between those cracks. So a parent will contact, for example, someone in the child care world, and that person will respond to the parent, oh no, we don't offer services to parents. Okay, so then they will go to family services, hoping to have access to some form of help for their parenting. Oh, we don't provide services to persons with disabilities. So there's always an excuse. There's always something that makes that they somehow don't fit in the current framework of services or resources.
Next week, in the Amplifying Voices event, we have one of the speakers who is now a grandmother. So not only a mother, but a grandmother of several granddaughters. Her name is Tracy Odell. I can say her name because she's openly sort of going to be talking about this next week. And when I spoke to her, I was very impressed because when I had my accident, one educator, that I met in the rehabilitation center mentioned this program, the Nurturing Assistant Program that was happening in Ontario. And she said, you should check it out, because I was a single mom to a 16-month-old. And I was sort of like wondering, how am I going to do this as I'm sort of, learning everything again, physically, how to do things, and having a rambunctious, young little man. And Tracy is actually so we're now 10 years later, Tracy is actually the person who got the Nurturing Assistant Program organized in Ontario. And she was explaining to me how, she fought for that because she was pregnant with her second child. And she had seen her husband do all the work, all the baby changing diapers and baby care with their firstborn. And so she felt that for her to be able to get involved in the parenting task, she needed someone to be her arms and her legs. Anyways, all that to say that this program exists, but the way she told me about is that if you're a parent who actually requires help with your own physical needs, so you require someone because your arms are not strong enough, for example, or you can't walk, then you have access to that program. But if you were, or if you are a parent like me 10 years ago, meaning paraplegic, I have full force of my arms, then that program would not have been available to me, because I could do the skills for me on my own. So then it was assumed that I would be able to do the skills for my child, when things are very different. And I think that's, it's Evelina who mentioned also employment and how certain roles are prioritized. And so for me, I was like, I had all the services I needed and wanted to go back to work. That I was very well supported. But because my son was 2 years old, well, Parents Plus clinic ends at 2 years old. So basically I got 0 services on the parenting, apart from maybe an educator who told me one day, you need to regain your role as a mother after being 6 months away from my child, which I was like, no, duh. Of course I do, but how do I do that now? So those conversations, I think, are what do we really need and how can we organize that is very important. And I want us to come back to those services questions, but maybe before we go back to what's needed in the future and what kind of services, if we had, any ideas, I would want to talk about the positives. So the positives in terms of parents and parenting with disabilities. What are the strengths? Did you notice that? What would that be in terms of your research that you would want to share?
Maybe I can start for this question. So I think in my research, I've seen parents having demonstrated a wide variety of skills, ranging from creativity, resilience, as you mentioned, Laura, previously, problem solving, advocacy skills in terms of, like, I think your last example, Marjorie, was really highlighting that very, very well, how often, too often, parents need to fight for their rights, fight to have access to supports and services and so on. But that is definitely a strength I saw in many parents, having that advocacy and kind of willingness to fight. But of course, all of that, it's time consuming and it takes a lot of energy and stamina. So I know your question was around the positives, but let's not forget how draining that can be to always being kind of in that alert mode and ready for your next fight, right? So I think I also saw kind of the beautiful adaptation. So maybe I'm more sensitive to that being an occupational therapist, but I saw how beautifully some parents and children work together in a different way than what we usually see represented maybe in our TV series and our movies and so on. But somehow they manage to do all that childcare in a different way. Using one arm, using no arm, using adaptive equipment, and so on. So there's something really, I think, in terms of a creative aspect to parenting that is not well known and not well represented, that I found is a big strength in parents.
Yeah, maybe, thank you, Evelina. Maybe what I could add is that for my participants, regardless of whether they received or not proper services or proper support, they usually felt a strong sense of being a good parent, of having a positive relationship with their children, of not feeling disabled by their children. Father told me that one day. I'm not feeling disabled when I'm with my daughter. For her, I'm her father, and we are doing our stuff, and that's it. And we have a good relationship. So I think it's something that work great for parents, but sometimes maybe it's also okay. Maybe it's also something that could be dangerous, because you have a great relationship with your children, everything is okay, I can manage, and so I will not fight for services, and services will never have to be better, because I found ways to work beautifully without services. So services can say, and governments can say, okay, we don't need to work more because it's okay for them. They are happy with their children. Children are okay, and so we don't have to do more. And sometimes it's something that I fight for in my research, because it's not the job of the parents, it's the job of the services to adapt and to be more here. And if the parents don't want the services, it's okay, but usually they are doing a palliative for the services. So that could be a problem. And usually when we are parents, we forgot all the bad that happened with services because we are focused on our relationship with our children. So that's something we see in obstetrical violences. Women doesn't do anything against obstetrical violence because they have their children, and they tend to forget for a time that it went bad. And sometimes it can be the same with parents with disability.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think that I've also seen similar things in terms of resilience and resistance, and the ways in which a lot of the moms in my study it exercises resistance. So sometimes it was standing up and, you know, yelling at their family member to say, listen, I'm effing the R word, to reclaim their identity and to sort of say, I've had enough. And I do have some things that I'm dealing with that does impact me, to sometimes leaving their abusive partners in order to make a better life for themselves, but mostly so that their children can have a better life. So certainly the resilience and the resistance was also something that I saw. And in terms of strengths also in their working relationships with professionals. So some of the parents talked about, and these are things that I think we're all practitioners, or we're practitioners, so I think it's something that we can relate to and maybe have been practiced upon as well. But parents talked about positive working relationships with their social workers, with their psychologists, with helping professionals, where there was trust, where they felt as though they were listened to, where they felt as though what they said mattered, and that they were the worker was identifying what's important to them, and starting with that really had an impact on the process. And I think we can all of us here can talk about some examples of where we've also seen, let's say there's a shift in worker, and there's a shift in a working relationship, and the impact that has on families. I know Marjorie has tons of those stories, and I think we all do. But we've seen it to the point where it's decreased the parents' anxiety. So it's in relation to having child welfare involved, having a new worker look at the parent and say, you know, you're a good mom, and we're going to work on this together. And the impact that had on the parent, you could see the change in their face and the decrease in their anxiety. So I think that's something else to consider when we're thinking about strengths, that working relationships, there can be some positive working relationships, even though part of the research is to also be critical of that, and to continue to reflect upon that and the power that professionals have in the lives of families. But there are also positive working relationships and things we need to build on.
Yes. It's interesting because it made me think of the concept of independence, and how, you know, this is something that we expect parents, period, to be independent, to raise their children independently. And I think even more when the parent has a disability to some extent. I mean, that's certainly some things that we've seen in research. Yet I was listening to Danny's documentary about her pregnancy, and delivery of her twins. And she also sort of mentioned sort of the notion of independence and interdependence. And that's something as a parent that I have also reflected upon. And I find that when we talk about relationships and about sort of asking for support or receiving support or having sort of, that help, someone to be our arms or legs if we need that, is something that's undervalued by society. Any thoughts from you guys?
Yes, I think that it's a myth that any of us, whether we have a disability or not, is independent, and particularly when we're a parent. So we have some sort of support system, whether it's a partner, whether it's a neighbor, the community, the church, formal services that are involved. And that is seen as natural. Whereas for a lot of our families, and even, for myself as somebody with a mobility issue, I think that it's pathologized. It's seen as negative. So if they receive services, it's because they can't do it on their own. It's because of their disability, as opposed to seeing it as we all need support. It may look differently and to individualize it, but it's often held against, especially parents with intellectual disabilities. And I'll let you guys speak to parents with various disabilities, but it's seen as negative. And so there is a double standard when it comes to parents with intellectual disabilities. And I think that would be one of the things I think that we need to shift our understanding of support, and also look at interdependence and mutual support, and look at the ways that parents with disabilities provide support to those around them, to their children, to their family members, to their partners. But we have to be looking at that more closely.
And I would also add that independence is also culture oriented, as we are living in and we are conducting our research in really individualistic societies. So maybe I don't conduct research in other areas of the world, but maybe we could learn something else about parenting with all kind of specifics, not only disabilities, but we are in a very individualistic society as well.
Maybe if I can add to that. So with my clinical background, and rehab and rehabilitation, that's kind of a big point, right? So persons who are in rehabilitation, kind of all the clinicians around them aim that person be the most independent once they finish or kind of have their rehab terminated at some point. And perhaps I was reflecting on what you said earlier, Marjorie, in terms of that educator telling you that you need to reclaim your mothering role. So I guess that was kind of her way of saying, or an invitation to kind of regain your independence in terms of your parenting role. So I think it is important to reflect on that. How can we facilitate parenting independently for parents with disabilities? But that being said, I think we definitely need to think from a clinical and from a research perspective on interdependence as well. There's like my colleagues just said, there's no parent that parents alone. So I think we particularly need to think about those parents who are isolated, maybe marginalized, who single parent, what kind of support systems we can make sure that they have in terms of, yes, being independent, but having those interdependence for some aspects maybe of their parenting that are too difficult, or that they don't have the energy to engage in, and so on.
Yeah, all of this I'm smiling because I'm thinking of like different things. I'm making links, and there's one research before you, Coralie, if you remember, from Sylvie Jutra's student, Sandra, who did a study, and she looked at character strength and identifying character strength in parents with disabilities. To me, that was both sort of amazing, because it was an area of research that we didn't really look at in terms of really focusing on identifying the strength. But it was also sort of amazing because personally, I had even thought of thinking of even my own disability as something that could bring me strength. And since then, I've researched, because that's what I do. When I find out about something that's interesting, I then research on that. And certainly when we talk about interdependence, we're actually talking about the character strength of teamwork and how two people or several people work together. And that could be with the professional, but that could be with, you know, in my case, my mom and my dad who were helping me raise, to some extent, you know, my son. And one thing that a story that I often sort of share is the day that, I don't know, my son must have been 3 years old, 4 years old. And there was something for parents at school. And so he had said to me, oh, well, I'll invite my parents with an S. And I told you I'm a single mom. So I was like, parents? What do you mean? Who do you mean? And he said, well, there's Mammy and there's Mammy, and she does, you know, go to the park with me, and there's Papi and he plays music with me. And then there's you, Mom, and you do everything else, and you're the boss anyways. So if I need something, I have to ask you first, right? And for him, it was sort of like, that's who my cocoon is. That's who are taking care of me. And there was no difference in terms of, well, there was hierarchy, obviously, because I'm the boss. Thank God he said that. I was very happy. But it was also sort of about how we worked well for his benefit. And it wasn't sort of like who does more, or are my parents doing for me or instead of me. But it was really sort of oriented towards that. And I think that those two, sort of Sandra's thesis in looking at character strength and us sort of having that lens. Like, for example, I also often say that my son is more solution focused probably than if I hadn't had a disability. He's definitely creative. I don't have the wheelchair with me, but as a 4-year-old, he was creating wheelchairs in Legos. He loves playing Legos. And at the time, there was no wheelchair Legos. So he built some. He took the wheels of another sort of construction and would do that. He would create, you know, his Lego constructions so that there was no stairs, there were ramps and so forth. And so everything was like oriented in terms of looking for solutions and being creative about it. He's also very socially driven, socially justice driven, in that he has this strength of fairness. And so all of these things are him being shaped by his environment, and his environment of having a mom with a disability has shaped those different elements. And so, yes, I think it's, you know, changing a little bit that lens into really focusing on, instead of what might they be missing or what might be harder. And there's certain things that might have been harder for him as a child, just like they are harder for me as a parent who became disabled. But there are also some beautiful moments and beautiful strength in that. And I think that that's what we need to also sort of recognize and focus on. I just want to make sure we have a bit of time for our guests to ask questions. So if we were to ask and try to sum up, is there anything that we should do in research or maybe in clinical practice that would be different? What would be that next step?
I was really inspired by the last part of our conversation around interdependence and teamwork. And I think whether for parents, families, clinicians, researchers, we definitely need to work more as a team. The event next week is called Amplifying Voices, and I think that we all collectively need to make sure that the voices of parents with disabilities are heard, understood, and put into application. So in order to do that, Coralie, you mentioned earlier, sometimes our systems work in silos. I think we cannot go into that direction. So we need to work as a team with our own frameworks, lenses, perspectives, but I think everyone has something to bring to the table in terms of contributions.
Yes.
Do you want to go?
Yes, Laura, did you want to go?
I can go after you, no problem.
Okay. No, I just wanna add that maybe as a community, we also have to expand our vision of parenthood. A parent is not only a mom with a dad, with two legs, two arms, with jobs, with money and everything. So maybe we have to expand our vision of parenthood, and maybe we have to develop a more public representation of parenting models in the space, in the TV, in the journal, in the series. You mentioned TV show earlier. So yeah, maybe we have to do that.
I agree. I think to jump, off of what all of you are saying is we need to reconceptualize support and what that means and what it could look like and how that needs to be centered in people's lives and realities. And also, Coralie, you had mentioned the influence of culture. So the influence of larger culture, Marjorie was talking about family culture, different cultures. I think that we have a lot to learn from various cultures, including our Indigenous communities. Just thinking about communal support and interdependence and holistic support. So I think that's something that we need to explore and look at how that can impact the way that we not only see people, but the way that we offer services.
Great. I would now sort of open up in the chat or our guests, if you have any questions that you want to ask any of us, you are more than welcome to do so. And it's okay if you don't. You have the email anyways, so you can send me an email at any point. And we are very generous gang of group of people. We love to serve and to make sure that the voice is represented. And I will maybe end on that, actually, in terms of representation. And Coralie, you mentioned it just now in terms of representation. I think this is why all of these events are being organized. And for sure, this is sort of a little bit what I triggered in terms of making sure that those events are happening, as I felt really strongly about that need to be represented, but to amplify voices of parents. But what I found, especially in finding the speakers for next week, is that I'm not the only parent with a disability that felt the need to be represented as well. And so, if I take, I talked about Tracy already, I talked about Danny and her documentary. She's done several different she holds a blog, and she did a webinar talking about sort of perinatal health in spinal cord injury. And the reason why she did that is to have representation and to educate and to make sure that people are not reacting and that they have information. And you have others like Krista Couture, who is an amputee, who also wrote a book, who also looked at, in terms of a blog and make sure that there were pictures that resembled her. And the way she did that is that she took picture of her being pregnant with her leg, showing, so that it would show that she was amputee and proud. There's Eliza Hall, who's going to be there from Australia, who also sort of, did a podcast, co-wrote a book with 25 families, headed by parents of different disabilities. She's currently editing a similar book, but with UK and US families with disabilities. And again, it was sort of that need of being represented and not being the only one, sort of being pregnant or dealing with, how should I do this? Or, we talked about being creative, but sometimes creativity comes from looking at what others are doing. And I think that that's all sort of pretty inspiring when we have that chance to create the community to be able to talk about, their realities and dream a little bit about what we could do next. And so on that, I really thank you all for being here today with us and for taking the time to share your knowledge. Coralie, Evelina, and Laura, thank you so much. And for our guests, thank you for being, even if it's late in your country, that's pretty awesome. And you can contact us at any time if there's any more questions. So thank you all.